The gaslights of London did little to pierce the particular gloom that had settled over the Ashworth townhouse, a gloom as pervasive and chilling as the November fog creeping in from the Thames. For Lady Annalise Ashworth, the dim light filtering through the tall, grimy windows of the morning room only served to illuminate the fine layer of dust on every surface, a testament to their fallen fortunes. 2 maids and a cook were all that remained of a once bustling staff. The silver had been sold, piece by agonizing piece. The carriage horses were gone, replaced by the grim necessity of hired hacks. And her father, the Viscount Ashworth, was a ghost in his own home, confined to his chambers by an ailment of the spirit as much as the body, broken by the ruinous investments that had brought them to this precipice. Annalise smoothed the worn velvet of her mourning gown, a dress she had worn for a year, yet it felt like a lifetime. Her mother's passing had been the first crack in the foundation of their world. Her father's financial collapse had been the earthquake that brought it all down. At 22, she was no longer a debutante with sparkling prospects, but a relic, the custodian of a crumbling house and a tarnished name. Her beauty, once celebrated in the society pages, now felt like a cruel joke. A fine porcelain vase with nothing to put in it, displayed in a house about to be seized by creditors. Her options, as laid out by their solicitor in a voice devoid of all sympathy, were stark. She could seek a position as a paid companion, a genteel form of servitude that would shatter what little pride she had left. Or she could marry. But marry whom? The young, ambitious lords who had once vied for her attention now looked through her as if she were made of glass. The only offers that had trickled in were from odious old men who saw her as a pretty ornament to adorn their final, gout-ridden years. The thought was a physical sickness in her throat. She stared out at the street, at the parade of carriages bearing ladies to their afternoon calls, their lives untouched by the desperation that was Annalise's constant companion. It was in that moment of quiet despair that the name entered her world, spoken in hushed tones by her maid, Ilara, who was ever a conduit for the city's gossip. "They say the Marquess of Blackwood is to attend the Duchess of Pemberley's ball tonight," Ilara had whispered, her hands pausing in their mending of a frayed lace cuff. "A rare sight it is. Hasn't been seen in town for years, not since the Marchioness passed." The Marquess of Blackwood, Alistair Beaumont. The name was a legend, a ghost story told in Mayfair drawing rooms. Impossibly wealthy, impossibly handsome, and impossibly remote. He had inherited the title and its vast estates under a cloud of tragedy. His young wife, a celebrated beauty, had died suddenly, leaving him with an infant daughter. Since then, he had retreated to his ancestral home, Blackwood Manor, a fortress of solitude in the heart of the countryside. He was known as the Marble Marquess, a man carved from stone, his heart buried with his wife. "They say he needs a new wife," Ilara continued, her voice dropping lower. "Not for love, mind you, for the child and for an heir. The Beaumont line needs securing." An idea, wild and shocking, took root in the barren soil of Annalise's mind. It was a mad thought, a desperate gamble, born of utter hopelessness. What if she could offer him a solution? She possessed a respectable title, an impeccable lineage, and a quiet dignity that had not yet been stripped from her. She had no illusions of love. Her heart had long since learned to expect nothing of the sort. What she needed was a lifeline. What he needed, it seemed, was a convenience, a transaction. The audacity of it made her breath catch. A lady did not propose terms. A lady did not throw herself at a man, especially not a man of his stature and reputation. It was a violation of every rule she had ever been taught, a social immolation from which she would never recover if it failed. But what did she have left to lose? Her reputation was already tarnished by poverty. Her future was a bleak, narrow path leading to obscurity. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window pane. The face that stared back was pale and serious, her eyes wide with a fear that was slowly being eclipsed by a strange, cold resolve. She would not become a companion. She would not sell herself to a lecherous baron. She would seize control of her own fate, even if it meant shattering it to pieces in the attempt. "Ilara," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the frantic turmoil in her chest. "I need my mother's blue silk, the one with the silver embroidery." Ilara's eyes widened. "My lady. But that's for a ball. We have no invitation to the Pemberley ball." "We do not need one," Annalise replied, a flicker of her old fire returning. "I am not going as a guest. I am going as an applicant for a position." The preparations were a frantic, secret affair. Ilara, her initial shock giving way to a fierce, protective loyalty, worked miracles. She sponged and pressed the blue silk until it shimmered like moonlight on water. She found a pair of long, white gloves that were only faintly yellowed. She arranged Annalise's dark hair into a simple but elegant chignon, weaving in a string of small seed pearls, the last remnant of her mother's jewelry box. There was no grand carriage, only a discreet hired cab that dropped her 2 streets away from the Pemberley townhouse. Annalise walked the remaining distance, the cold night air a sharp slap against her cheeks. The street was a river of polished carriages and liveried footmen. Light and music spilled from the grand mansion, a world of warmth and laughter from which she was irrevocably excluded. She felt a tremor of doubt, a wave of nausea. This was madness. She should turn back, retreat to the familiar shadows of her own decaying home. But then, the image of her father's gaunt face, the scent of dust and defeat in their house, rose before her. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked towards the grand entrance. She did not join the queue of glittering guests. Instead, she slipped through a side gate into the manicured gardens she knew ran along the flank of the house. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of silk and bone. She moved through the sculpted hedges, a shadow in blue, until she found the French doors leading to the conservatory. They were, as she had gambled, unlocked to allow guests to take the air. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she pushed one open and stepped inside. The air was warm and thick with the scent of orchids and damp earth. Through the glass panels, she could see the ballroom, a kaleidoscope of color and movement. And there, standing near a marble pillar, aloof and separate from the swirling crowd, was him, the Marquess of Blackwood. He was exactly as the whispers described, yet more potent, more real. Tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in immaculate black evening wear that made him seem like a figure carved from obsidian. His hair was as dark as a raven's wing, his face a study in severe, aristocratic beauty. But it was his expression that held her captive. It was a mask of cold indifference, his grey eyes sweeping over the glittering assembly with a boredom that bordered on contempt. He held a glass of champagne, but did not drink from it. He was a statue in a room full of dancers, a block of ice in a sea of warmth. Annalise watched him, her resolve hardening. This was a man who felt nothing. He would understand a transaction. He would not complicate it with sentiment. He was her only chance. She waited for a moment when he was most isolated, when the currents of the party had momentarily drawn the surrounding groups away. Then, gathering every ounce of her courage, she stepped out of the conservatory and walked towards him, her slippers making no sound on the polished marble floor. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, noting her unescorted arrival, her simple gown, her lack of invitation. The whispers began, a rustle of silk and speculation. She ignored them. Her focus was entirely on the cold, remote man by the pillar. She stopped a few feet from him. He did not notice her at first, his gaze fixed on some distant point above the dancers' heads. "My Lord Blackwood," she said, her voice lower than she intended, but clear and steady. His head turned. Those grey eyes, the colour of a winter storm, settled on her. There was no surprise, no curiosity, only a faint, chilling flicker of appraisal. He took in her dress, her face, her presence, where she so clearly did not belong. He said nothing. The silence stretched, a taut wire of social humiliation. Annalise refused to break. She had come this far. "I am Lady Annalise Ashworth," she continued, forcing herself to meet his unnervingly direct gaze. "I believe we have a matter of mutual interest to discuss." A single dark eyebrow arched, the only sign of life in that marble face. "I cannot imagine what that might be, Lady Annalise. I do not know you, and you are not on the Duchess's guest list." His voice was a low, resonant baritone, as cold and smooth as the stone he resembled. "That is precisely why we must speak," she pressed on, her heart now a frantic drum against her ribs. "What I have to propose is not a matter for a ballroom. It is a matter of business." For the first time, a spark of something, not warmth, but perhaps intrigue, entered his eyes. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod towards the conservatory she had just left. "You have 2 minutes." He led the way, his stride long and confident. Annalise followed, her back ramrod straight, acutely aware of the stares and whispers that trailed in their wake. They stepped back into the humid, floral-scented air of the conservatory. He did not offer her a seat. He simply turned, his arms crossed over his powerful chest, and waited. The music from the ballroom was a muted, cheerful pulse, a world away from the cold tension between them. "My lord," she began, choosing her words with surgical precision, "I have been made aware of your circumstances. I understand you are in need of a new marchioness." His expression did not change, but she felt the temperature in the air drop several degrees. "My circumstances are not a topic for public gossip or for the ears of uninvited strangers." "And my circumstances," she countered, her voice gaining strength, "are what compel me to dispense with propriety. My family is ruined. My father is ill. My name is all I have left of value. It is a good name, an old name. You require a wife of suitable standing to be a mother to your daughter, and, I presume, to provide you with an heir. I require financial salvation for my family." She paused, letting the brutal honesty of her words hang in the air between them. "I am proposing a contract, my lord, a marriage. In exchange for my title, my discretion, and my commitment to fulfilling the duties of the Marchioness of Blackwood, you will settle my family's debts and provide a generous allowance for my father's care." She finished, her chest tight, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had laid herself bare, stripping away all pretense and romance, reducing the sacred institution of marriage to a cold, hard bargain. She watched his face, searching for any sign of reaction, disgust, anger, amusement. She found nothing. He was utterly, unnervingly still. He studied her for a long, silent moment. His grey eyes moved over her face, not with desire, but with the detached scrutiny of a man assessing a piece of property. He seemed to be weighing her words, her appearance, her sheer, desperate audacity. "You are bold, Lady Annalise," he said at last, his voice devoid of inflection. "Or foolish. I have not yet decided which." "I am practical, my lord," she replied. "As I believe, are you." A flicker of something, was it respect, or merely surprise, crossed his features before being instantly suppressed. "You understand that such an arrangement would be devoid of affection, of any of the usual comforts of marriage." "I would expect nothing of the sort," she said, her voice firm. "My expectations are purely contractual. I would be a mother to your child, a hostess for your home, and the vessel for your heir. I would require nothing from you personally. Your heart, my lord, is of no concern to me." The finality of her declaration seemed to hang in the air. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow of pain in his eyes, a deep, ancient wound briefly exposed, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the cold, impenetrable grey. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Very well, Lady Annalise. Your proposal is unorthodox, but it has the virtue of honesty. Send your solicitor to mine in the morning. We will have the contracts drawn up." He turned to leave, dismissing her as if their conversation was already a distant memory. "My lord," she called after him, a sudden, vital question occurring to her. "Your daughter, what is her name?" He stopped at the threshold of the conservatory, his back still to her. "Her name is Lillian," he said, his voice flat and remote. "She is 5 years old, and she does not speak." And with that, he was gone, melting back into the glittering ballroom, leaving Annalise alone amongst the orchids, the muted music, a mocking counterpoint to the silent, cold reality of the bargain she had just struck. She had saved her family, but she had just sold her life to a man of stone and his silent, broken child. The weight of her new reality settled upon her, as heavy and suffocating as the humid air. The wedding was a swift, sterile affair, conducted in a dusty solicitor's office with only her father, looking frail and bewildered, and Lord Blackwood's grim-faced lawyer as witnesses. There were no flowers, no music, no well-wishes. There was only the scratch of a pen on parchment and a quiet exchange of vows that felt more like the closing of a business deal than the beginning of a life together. Alistair, her new husband, placed a plain gold band on her finger. His touch was brief and cold, his grey eyes unreadable. He had not spoken a single personal word to her since the night of the ball. All communication had been through their solicitors. The contracts were ironclad, his generosity in settling her family's debts undeniable, and his emotional distance absolute. The journey to Blackwood Manor was undertaken in a state of numb apprehension. They sat opposite each other in his perfectly appointed carriage, the silence between them as vast and empty as the rolling countryside that flashed past the windows. He read a book, never once looking up. Annalise watched the landscape change, the neat hedgerows of the south giving way to the wilder, more dramatic scenery of the north. The sky grew heavy with clouds, the colour of slate mirroring the Marquess's eyes and her own sinking spirits. Blackwood Manor appeared suddenly, a Gothic masterpiece of grey stone and soaring turrets that seemed to rise directly from the rugged earth. It was magnificent, imposing, and utterly devoid of welcome. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to keep the world at bay. As the carriage crunched to a halt on the gravel drive, a fine, chilling rain began to fall. A line of servants stood waiting on the steps, their faces impassive, presided over by a severe-looking housekeeper in black bombazine. Mrs. Croft, her eyes small and sharp, missed nothing. Annalise felt their collective gaze upon her, a silent, unified judgment. She was the newcomer, the stranger, the woman who had taken the place of their first beloved Marchioness. "Welcome to Blackwood, my lady," Alistair said, his first direct words to her that day. The title sounded strange and foreign on his lips. He did not offer her his hand as she descended from the carriage. He led her into the great hall. It was a cavernous space, dominated by a massive stone fireplace, where no fire burned. Suits of armour stood like silent sentinels in the shadows, and portraits of stern-faced Beaumont ancestors stared down from the dark panelled walls. The air was cold, still, and smelled faintly of beeswax and old stone. The only sound was the echo of their footsteps. "Mrs. Croft will show you to your rooms," he said, his tone clipped and formal. "They are in the west wing. My own are in the north. We will dine together this evening at 8. Punctuality is expected." He did not wait for a reply, simply turned and strode down a long corridor, his boots echoing on the marble, until he was swallowed by the gloom. Annalise was left standing in the centre of the hall with the formidable housekeeper. "This way, my lady," Mrs. Croft said, her voice as starched as her collar. Annalise followed her up a grand, sweeping staircase, her hand trailing on the cold, polished oak of the banister. She was led down a long gallery, past more portraits and closed doors. Every footfall seemed to be absorbed by the thick carpets and heavy tapestries, reinforcing the oppressive silence of the house. "These are your chambers," the housekeeper announced, opening a set of double doors. The rooms were luxurious, impeccably furnished, with a large canopied bed, a rosewood writing desk, and a sitting area with a velvet chaise longue. A small fire had been lit in the hearth, but it did little to dispel the chill that seemed to seep from the very walls of the manor. Her trunks had already been brought up and unpacked by an invisible hand. "Your maid, Ilara, has been given a room nearby," Mrs. Croft informed her. "Dinner is formal. Is there anything else?" I should like to see Lillian," Annalise said, the name feeling unfamiliar on her tongue. A flicker of something, surprise, disapproval, crossed the housekeeper's face. "Miss Lillian is in the nursery. She keeps to her routine. It is not wise to disrupt it." "I am her mother now, Mrs. Croft," Annalise replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I will see her." The housekeeper's lips thinned into a hard line, but she nodded curtly. "As you wish, my lady. The nursery is at the end of this corridor." She gestured vaguely before turning and leaving, her footsteps silent as she retreated. Annalise found the nursery door slightly ajar. She pushed it open gently and stepped inside. The room was large and filled with toys, a beautiful dollhouse, a rocking horse, shelves of leather-bound storybooks, but they all looked pristine, untouched. And there, sitting on a window seat, staring out at the rain-slicked grounds, was a small, solitary figure. Lillian Beaumont was a miniature version of her father. She had the same raven dark hair, cut in a neat fringe across her brow, and the same pale porcelain skin. When she turned her head, Annalise saw she had his eyes too, not the stormy grey of the Marquess, but a softer, dove grey, wide and shadowed, with a sorrow no child should ever know. She clutched a worn, plush rabbit in her arms, her knuckles white. She looked at Annalise with an unnerving, silent appraisal, her expression as unreadable as her father's. "Hello, Lillian," Annalise said softly, taking a tentative step into the room. "I am Annalise." The child did not respond. She simply stared, her gaze solemn and unwavering. There was no fear in her eyes, but no welcome either. It was a profound, unnerving emptiness. Annalise knelt down so she was at the girl's level. "That's a very handsome rabbit you have." Silence. Lillian's grip on the rabbit tightened. Annalise tried again. "I saw the most beautiful gardens from my window. Do you ever play in them?" The child's gaze flickered towards the window, then back to Annalise. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Annalise stayed for a while longer, speaking softly about simple things. The rain, the color of the walls, the pictures in a book she picked up. Lillian never uttered a sound. She was a small, silent island in a sea of opulent quiet. Annalise eventually retreated, the silence of the child echoing the greater silence of the house, a profound and deeply unsettling stillness that seemed to emanate from a central, hidden grief. Later, as she explored the wing her chambers were in, she found it. At the far end of the gallery, a corridor branched off, leading to what she presumed was the east wing of the manor. A heavy oak door blocked the way. It was not just closed, it was locked. A film of dust lay thick on the floor before it, undisturbed by the passage of feet. It was a sealed part of the house, a place deliberately forgotten. Standing before that locked door, Annalise felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. This house was not empty. It was full. It was full of the memory of the first Marchioness, full of a grief so powerful it had silenced a child and turned a man to stone. And now it was her home. She had made her bargain, and this was the price: to live as a ghost among ghosts, in a house where the past was a locked door and the future was a silent, empty hall. Dinner that evening was an exercise in strained formality. They sat at opposite ends of a dining table that could have seated 30, the vast expanse of polished mahogany between them a physical representation of their emotional distance. Alistair was a formidable presence, his silence as heavy and solid as the silver candlesticks. He ate with a focused precision, his attention on his plate, his posture rigid. Annalise found her appetite had vanished. She pushed the exquisitely prepared food around her plate, the clink of her fork against the porcelain sounding like a gunshot in the cavernous room. She tried to initiate a conversation, her voice feeling small and thin in the echoing space. The journey was quite scenic. "Indeed," he replied, not looking up. "The manor is very grand. It has been in my family for 300 years. His answers were facts, delivered without inflection, designed to close conversations, not open them. Annalise fell silent, defeated. She studied him from across the chasm of the table, trying to find a chink in his armor. His face, illuminated by the flickering candlelight, was a mask of cold control. But she saw the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the stem of his wineglass. This was not a man at peace. This was a man at war with himself. And the battlefield was this silent, grieving house. Over the next few weeks, A bleak routine established itself. Annalise would wake, breakfast alone in the small morning room, and then wander the lonely halls of her new prison. She saw her husband only at dinner, where their stilted, brief exchanges became the norm. He spent his days locked in his study, managing the vast Beaumont estates, a task he seemed to approach with the same dispassionate efficiency he applied to everything else. He was a phantom lord in his own home. His presence felt more as an absence, a cold spot in the air. Her attempts to connect with Lillian were met with the same silent, unnerving resistance. Annalise would spend an hour in the nursery each day, reading aloud, trying to engage the child in a game, or simply sitting quietly with her. Lillian would watch her, her grey eyes solemn, her little body tense, clutching her stuffed rabbit as if it were a shield. The child's governess, Miss Finch, was a nervous, mousy woman who seemed terrified of both her charge and her employer, and offered no help or insight. It was as if Lillian's silence was a rule of the house, an edict no one dared to break. The staff, following the lead of Mrs. Croft, treated Annalise with a correct, chilly deference. They were polite, efficient, and utterly impenetrable. She was "my lady," the new Marchioness, but she knew they saw her as an interloper. She could feel the ghost of her predecessor, Helena, in every room. Her portrait hung in the long gallery, a beautiful, laughing woman with sunshine in her hair and eyes full of life. It was a stark, painful contrast to the somber reality of the house she had left behind. Annalise felt like a pale imitation, a shadow brought in to fill a space that could never truly be occupied. It was her exploration of the grounds that offered her the only solace. The parkland was vast and beautiful, a wild tapestry of ancient woods, rolling hills, and a brooding, dark lake. But it was a particular, walled section behind the east wing that drew her in. She found the gate rusted but unlocked. Pushing it open, she stepped into a place of heartbreaking neglect. It had once been a magnificent rose garden. The formal layout was still visible: intricate knot gardens, elegant arbors, and stone pathways. But it was choked with weeds. The rose bushes were overgrown and thorny, their blooms small and blighted. A stone sundial in the center was covered in moss, its face obscured. It was a place of profound sadness, a testament to a love that had been abandoned to decay. She found the head gardener, a weathered old man named Mr. Abernathy, pruning a yew hedge with grim determination. When she asked him about the walled garden, his face clouded over. "That was her ladyship's garden," he said, his voice raspy. "The first Marchioness, her pride and joy it was, grew the most beautiful blossoms you ever did see. The blackwood bloom she called her favourite, a dark red rose she cultivated herself." He sighed, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Hasn't been touched since the day since she passed." His lordship gave the order. No one is to set foot in there. Annalise stood there, the image of the choked, dying garden burning in her mind. It was a mirror of the house, of the family within it. It was a heart that had been locked and left to wither, a symbol of the grief that held them all captive. A quiet, defiant resolve began to form within her. She had been brought to this house to be a mother and a Marchioness, but she could not be either in a place so steeped in death. She could not raise a child in a mausoleum. She could not live as a ghost. If Alastair had locked away his heart, if Lillian had locked away her voice, then she would start with what she could touch. She would start with the garden. The next morning, she put on a simple cotton dress and a pair of sturdy gloves she found in a potting shed. Armed with a pair of shears and a trowel, she returned to the secret garden. She started in one corner, her hands clumsy at first, but her determination fierce. She began to clear the weeds, to cut back the dead wood, her movements slow and deliberate. It was back-breaking work. Her muscles ached, and her hands were scratched and raw by the end of the day. But as she worked, a strange sense of peace settled over her. Here, in this forgotten place, she was not the Marchioness. She was not a bargain. She was simply a woman, tending to something broken, hoping to bring it back to life. She made the garden her sanctuary. Every day she would spend hours there, clearing, pruning, and nurturing the neglected roses. Ilara, ever loyal, would bring her water and offer to help, but Annalise preferred to work alone. This was her battle, her quiet act of rebellion against the oppressive sorrow of Blackwood Manor. She also persisted with Lillian. She changed her approach. Instead of trying to force a connection with words, she simply shared her silence. She brought a sketchbook to the nursery and would sit and draw the birds she saw outside the window. She brought a small lap loom and began to weave colourful threads into a tapestry. She did not ask Lillian to join her, but she left paper and coloured pencils on the table, an open invitation. For weeks, nothing changed. Lillian remained a silent observer. Alistair remained a distant, cold presence at the dinner table. But Annalise did not give up. She poured her frustration, her loneliness, and her sliver of hope into the soil of the dying garden. She was beginning to understand that Blackwood Manor was not a place you could change with grand gestures. Its secrets were deep, its wounds old. If there was to be any healing, it would have to start small, like a single, determined shoot pushing its way through the hard, unforgiving earth. She would cultivate this garden, and she would cultivate the silent child's trust, and perhaps, just perhaps, life would find a way to bloom again in the cold, shadowed heart of Blackwood. One crisp afternoon, weeks into her solitary labour, something shifted. Annalise was on her knees in the rose garden, carefully loosening the soil around a particularly stubborn-looking bush, when she felt a small presence behind her. She turned slowly, her heart giving a hopeful leap. Lillian stood at the edge of the cleared pathway, her ever-present rabbit clutched in her hand. She was watching Annalise, her small face a mask of solemn curiosity. Annalise didn't speak, remembering how words seemed to make the child retreat. Instead, she offered a small, gentle smile and turned back to her work, her movements calm and unthreatening. She continued to weed, acutely aware of the child's eyes on her. After a few minutes, Lillian took a tentative step onto the path, then another. She stopped beside a stone bench, her gaze sweeping over the small patch of ground that Annalise had managed to clear. It was still a fraction of the overgrown space, but it was a start. A few of the hardier rose bushes, freed from the choking weeds, were showing signs of new green life. Lillian pointed a small finger at a tiny, unfurling leaf. It was the first gesture of communication Annalise had ever seen from her. Annalise's breath caught. She nodded, her smile widening. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely disturbing the quiet air. "It's new. It's growing." The child's finger remained pointed for a moment longer before she dropped her hand. She didn't come any closer, and after a while, she turned and slipped away as silently as she had arrived. But it was a monumental victory. A seed of trust had been planted. That evening at dinner, Annalise felt a flicker of warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. She looked at her husband at the far end of the table, his face as remote and unreadable as ever. She felt a sudden, strange urge to tell him about his daughter's small breakthrough, to share the moment with him. But she stopped herself. He had shown no interest in the child beyond ensuring she was clothed and fed. To him, Lillian was a duty, a problem, a living reminder of his loss. Sharing this fragile moment felt like offering a delicate blossom to a man made of ice. It would only freeze and shatter. A few days later, the invitation came. A note, delivered on a silver tray, from Lady Beatrice Danbury. The name was familiar to Annalise from the society pages. She was Alistair's cousin, a beautiful and formidable widow, known for her sharp tongue and social ambition. The note informed them, in a tone that was more of a declaration than a request, that she would be arriving in a fortnight for an extended visit. Annalise handed the note to Alistair across the dinner table. He read it, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly. Beatrice, he said, the name sounding like a sigh of resignation. He placed the note down. She will expect to be entertained. I will make the necessary arrangements, Annalise replied, her voice cool and formal. It would be her first duty as a hostess, her first test as the new Marchioness. As she worked on her drawing in the nursery the next day, Lillian did something unprecedented. She left her post at the window, walked over to the table where Annalise sat, and picked up one of the colored pencils. Her movements were hesitant but deliberate. She took a piece of paper and, with intense concentration, began to draw. She drew a lopsided circle with a smiling face, and next to it, a strange, spiky shape. She then pushed the paper towards Annalise, her grey eyes looking up expectantly. Annalise's heart swelled. "Oh, Lillian, this is wonderful," she said softly. "Is this you?" She pointed to the smiling circle. Lillian nodded. "And what is this?" Annalise asked, indicating the spiky shape. Lillian looked at the shape, then pointed out the window, towards the rose garden. Annalise understood immediately. It was a rose bush, a thorny, wild thing, but a rose bush nonetheless. In the child's mind, she and the garden were connected. Annalise took a fresh sheet of paper and began to sketch the garden as it was now, with one small corner cleared and blooming. She drew herself, a simple stick figure kneeling in the dirt, and she drew Lillian standing on the path. When she was finished, she pushed it towards the little girl. Lillian looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she picked up a green pencil and carefully, painstakingly, drew a single, perfect leaf on one of Annalise's sketched rose bushes. She looked up at Annalise, and for the first time, the ghost of a smile touched her lips. It was in that moment, in the quiet of the nursery, with a shared drawing between them, that Annalise felt the first true crack in the wall of her loneliness. She was not just a placeholder Marchioness. She was the woman who was teaching a silent child to communicate, the woman who was bringing a dead garden back to life. The day of Lady Beatrice's arrival dawned grey and blustery. A storm was brewing, both outside and, Annalise suspected, within the walls of the manor. She had overseen the preparation of the finest guest suite, ordered a special menu from the cook, and dressed in one of her more elegant gowns. She would meet this challenge with the dignity and grace required of her station. Beatrice swept into the great hall like a whirlwind of silk and scent, trailing luggage, a lady's maid, and an air of supreme self-confidence. She was strikingly beautiful, with fiery auburn hair and intelligent, calculating green eyes. She greeted Alistair with an effusive kiss on both cheeks, a gesture of familiarity that he accepted with his usual stoic reserve. Then she turned to Annalise, her eyes raking over her from head to toe in a cool, dismissive appraisal. "So, you are the new addition," Beatrice said, her voice smooth as cream, but with an undertone of steel. "Alistair, you neglected to mention she was quite so unassuming." Annalise felt a flush of anger, but kept her expression serene. "Welcome to Blackwood, Lady Beatrice. We are pleased to have you." "Of course you are," Beatrice replied, with a thin smile, turning her attention back to Alistair. "Darling, you look tired. This dreary place. I've always said you need more life, more colour. We must have a house party, a ball, even. Shake the dust from these old tapestries." Throughout dinner, Beatrice dominated the conversation, regaling them with gossip from London, peppering her stories with fond reminiscences of her time at Blackwood with Alistair and Helena. She spoke the dead woman's name with a casual intimacy, weaving her into the conversation as if she were still alive, a constant, glittering presence. "Do you remember, Alistair, that summer Helena planted those dreadful yellow roses by the lake? She insisted they were cheerful. I told her they were vulgar, but she had such a stubborn streak, so full of life." Annalise watched her husband's face. Each mention of his late wife's name was like a small, sharp blow. His posture grew more rigid, the mask of indifference settling more firmly into place. He was retreating, closing himself off, and Beatrice was wielding the memory of Helena like a weapon. The next day, Beatrice's campaign began in earnest. She found Annalise in the morning room. "My dear," she said, arranging herself gracefully on a settee, "I do hope you don't mind a bit of friendly advice. This house, it has standards. Helena was the most extraordinary hostess. Her taste was impeccable. Your gown last night, for instance. A trifle. Simple for the Marchioness of Blackwood. Wouldn't you agree?" The condescension was delivered with a brilliant smile, making it all the more insulting. Worse was her encounter with Lillian. Beatrice swept into the nursery, her voice loud and jarring in the quiet space. "There you are, you poor silent little thing. Does she ever speak, this new mother of yours?" she asked Miss Finch, completely ignoring Annalise. Lillian, who had been sitting at the table with Annalise, immediately shrank back, her small face pale with alarm. She grabbed her rabbit and retreated to the window seat, turning her back on the room. "She is sensitive to loud noises," Annalise said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Nonsense. She's sullen. Helena was always so vibrant. It's a pity none of it passed to the child," Beatrice declared, then swept out again, leaving a trail of perfume and discord in her wake. The progress Annalise had made with Lillian vanished. The child refused to draw, refused to even look at her. She was once again a small, unreachable island of silence. Annalise's heart ached with a mixture of sorrow and pure, unadulterated rage. That evening, the storm finally broke, lashing the manor with wind and rain. The atmosphere at dinner was electric with unspoken tension. Beatrice, oblivious, or perhaps reveling in the discord she had created, continued her stream of chatter. "I passed the old rose garden today," she said, tapping a long finger against her wine glass. "What a tragic sight. Helena poured her very soul into that garden. It was her sanctuary. To see it so neglected, it's like a second death, isn't it, Alistair?" Alistair, who had been silent for most of the meal, finally looked up. His eyes, when they met Beatrice's, were chips of ice. "The garden is no longer your concern, Beatrice." "Oh, but it is," she insisted brightly. "Everything that was Helena's is my concern. Someone must protect her memory, after all. I've heard your new wife has been digging in it, like a common labourer. I find it terribly distasteful. Tearing up Helena's legacy. That was the final straw." Annalise placed her napkin on the table, her hands trembling slightly. "That garden was dying," she said, her voice low and clear, cutting through Beatrice's monologue. "It was choked and abandoned. I am not destroying a legacy. I'm trying to save it." "Save it," Beatrice laughed, a short, sharp sound. "My dear, you couldn't possibly understand. You didn't know her. That garden was a reflection of her spirit. It is meant to be left in peace, a memorial to what was lost." "A memorial," Annalise countered, her anger making her bold. "Or a tomb? This house is full of tombs. You speak of protecting a memory, but all you are doing is worshipping a ghost. And your worship is harming the living. It's harming Lillian." The name of his daughter hung in the air. Alistair's head snapped towards her. His expression was thunderous, a storm of emotions she could not decipher. "You will not speak of my daughter," he said, his voice a low growl. "I will," Annalise shot back, rising from her chair. "Because I am her mother. And I will not stand by while you and she gestured towards a stunned Beatrice, allow this house to be suffocated by a grief that has gone on for far too long. A garden is meant to be alive. A child is meant to speak. A house is meant to be a home, not a shrine to the dead." She was breathing heavily, her heart pounding. She had finally said it. All the things that had been building inside her for months. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the howl of the wind outside. Beatrice looked from Annalise to Alistair, an expression of triumph on her face. She had succeeded in creating a rift. She had provoked the quiet little mouse into showing her claws. But Alistair was not looking at Beatrice. He was staring at Annalise. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen before. It was not anger. It was something deeper, something far more painful. It was shock. It was recognition. It was the look of a man who had just been struck by a truth he had spent 5 years denying. Without another word, he pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the floor, and strode from the room. Annalise was left standing there, her defiant words still echoing in the stifling air, her future at Blackwood Manor hanging precariously in the balance. She had either just destroyed everything, or she had finally, violently, broken through. Annalise stood frozen in the dining room, her own words ringing in her ears. The triumphant smirk on Beatrice's face was more than she could bear. Without a glance in her direction, Annalise turned and fled, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to escape the suffocating atmosphere of that room. She ran up the grand staircase, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her mind a whirlwind of fear and regret. What had she done? She had violated the terms of their agreement, the cold, unspoken rule of their marriage. She was not to touch his heart, his past, his grief. And she had just taken a sledgehammer to all three. She expected him to send for her, to dismiss her, to send her back to London in disgrace. The contract would be broken. Her family would be ruined once more. She reached her chambers, her hand shaking as she turned the knob. But as she stepped inside, a A strange impulse seized her. She didn't stop. She walked past her own door, down the long, silent gallery, drawn by an invisible thread towards the one place she had never been. She walked towards the east wing. She stopped before the locked oak door, her chest heaving. She reached out and tried the handle. It was, as always, locked fast. She sagged against the cool wood, tears of frustration and despair finally welling in her eyes. It was all locked away. The house, the child, the man. And she was locked out. "It is not a shrine." The voice came from behind her, low and rough, with an emotion she couldn't name. She spun around. Alistair was standing there, halfway down the gallery, his tall frame cloaked in shadow. The storm outside raged, and a flash of lightning briefly illuminated his face. It was a ruin. The marble mask had shattered, and in its place was a landscape of raw, unvarnished agony. He walked towards her, his steps slow and heavy. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the door between them. "You were right," he said, his voice hoarse, "about all of it." He reached into his waistcoat pocket and pulled out a large, ornate iron key. It was dark with age. With a hand that trembled slightly, he inserted it into the lock. The sound of the mechanism turning was unnervingly loud in the silent corridor, a groan of protest from years of disuse. He pushed the door open. The air that billowed out was stale, cold, and thick with the scent of dust and dried flowers. It was the smell of a room that had been sealed for a very long time. He looked at her, his grey eyes dark with a terrible pain. "She did not die of an illness, Annalise. Not a fever, not a consumption. It was an accident. Here." He gestured for her to enter. Annalise's heart pounded with a mixture of dread and a strange, burgeoning compassion. This was it. This was the heart of the house, the source of all its sorrow. She stepped over the threshold, into the past. They were the chambers of the late Marchioness, a beautiful sitting room, furnished in pale blues and creams, now shrouded in white dustcloths like a room full of ghosts. Through an adjoining door, she could see a bedroom, the canopy of the bed draped in white. Everything was perfectly preserved, a moment frozen in time. But it felt wrong, unnatural. This wasn't preservation. It was a tomb. Alistair walked to the tall windows at the far end of the sitting room. They overlooked the walled rose garden. Even in the darkness, illuminated by the flashes of lightning, she could see the tangled chaos below. "It was her favorite place," he said, his voice a raw whisper. He stared out the window, but Annalise knew he wasn't seeing the garden as it was now. He was seeing it as it had been. She was life. Everything she touched, she made beautiful. The garden. It was her masterpiece. He fell silent for a long moment, lost in a memory. Annalise waited, her hands clasped before her, hardly daring to breathe. Lillian was just a baby, not even a year old. Helena had been in the garden all afternoon, tending to her roses. It was a perfect summer day. I was in my study, working. I grew impatient. We were meant to be riding, and she had lost track of the time, as she often did. When she was with her flowers, his voice cracked, and he paused to compose himself, his hand pressed against the cold window pane. I went to fetch her. I was angry, annoyed about some trivial estate matter. I called to her from this window. She was standing on a small stone ladder, trying to prune the highest branches of the climbing rose on the far wall. She turned when she heard my voice. She smiled. He closed his eyes, a spasm of pain crossing his face. She smiled, and she waved, and she lost her footing. It was so fast. The ladder tilted. She fell. Annalise gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She hit her head on the stone edge of the fountain, he continued, his voice flat and dead, stripped of all emotion. By the time I reached her, it was too late. She was gone. One moment she was there, smiling at me, and the next, he couldn't finish the sentence. The silence in the room was profound, filled with the weight of his confession. The storm outside seemed to rage in sympathy, a howl of grief against the glass. I was the last thing she saw, he whispered, his back still to her. An impatient, angry scowl. My last words to her were sharp, dismissive. I called her name in anger, and it cost her her life. If I had just waited, if I hadn't been so consumed with my own damned importance, she would still be here. He finally turned to face her. Tears were carving paths through the dust on his cheeks. The marble Marquess was gone. In his place was a man utterly, hopelessly broken by guilt. I locked these rooms, he said, his voice trembling. I locked the garden. I thought if I could just keep it all the same, keep it as she left it, then maybe it wasn't real. I tried to freeze time, but you were right. I didn't build a memorial. I built a prison. For me. For my daughter. He looked at her, his eyes pleading, searching for something. Absolution, understanding. He didn't seem to know what. Lillian. He breathed. She was in her pram nearby. She saw it all. She saw her mother fall. She heard me. She heard me scream. She hasn't spoken a word since that day. The doctors said it was the shock, that she would speak when she felt safe. But how can a child feel safe when her own father is a ghost, when her home is a tomb? Annalise's own tears were flowing freely now, tears of sorrow for the vibrant woman who had died, for the silent, traumatized child, and for this man who had been punishing himself in silence for 5 long years. She closed the distance between them, her earlier anger completely forgotten, replaced by an overwhelming wave of compassion. She did not know what to say. There were no words for a tragedy of this magnitude, so she did the only thing she could. She reached out and placed her hand gently on his arm. His entire body flinched at her touch, as if he had forgotten what human contact felt like. But he didn't pull away. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face, his expression one of utter desolation. "It was not your fault, Alistair," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It was a terrible, terrible accident." "But I caused it," he insisted, his voice raw. "No," she said firmly, her fingers tightening on his arm. "You did not. You were a part of the moment, but you were not the cause. You have been carrying a burden that was never yours to bear." He stared at her, the conflict warring in his eyes. He wanted to believe her. She could see it. He was desperate to believe her. "You honor Helena's memory, not by locking it away in the dark," she continued softly, "but by letting the light back in, by living again, by letting your daughter live again." The storm outside began to subside, the thunder receding into a low grumble, the rain softening to a gentle pattern against the windows. It was as if the house itself was exhaling, releasing a breath it had held for 5 years. In the quiet aftermath of the storm and his confession, Alistair looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw not the woman from the cold business arrangement, not the intruder, but the person who had just stood in the heart of his pain and had not flinched. He saw the compassion in her tear-filled eyes, the strength in her gentle touch. Slowly, hesitantly, he raised his hand and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was electric, a spark of warmth in the cold, dead room. It was a gesture of such profound intimacy, so far removed from the cold contract that defined their marriage, that it stole her breath. He didn't pull his hand away. He let it cup her face, his thumb stroking her skin. His own grief was still raw in his eyes, but it was now mingled with something else, something new and fragile. Gratitude, connection, a flicker of hope in the ruins of his heart. Annalise leaned into his touch, a silent acceptance of this new, terrifying, and beautiful intimacy. The space between them, once a vast, unbridgeable chasm, had vanished. They were no longer the Marquess and his convenient wife. They were two people standing together in a room full of ghosts, finding a fragile human solace in the wreckage of the past. He lowered his head, his forehead coming to rest against hers. He closed his eyes, and a long, shuddering breath escaped him. It was the sound of a man surrendering, of a wall that had stood for 5 years, finally beginning to crumble. In that moment, in the shared silence of the dusty, forgotten room, the terms of their marriage were irrevocably broken. A new, unwritten contract was being forged, not in a solicitor's office, but in the crucible of shared vulnerability and nascent trust. The cold truce was over. Something new, something terrifying and tender, was just beginning. The days that followed were marked by a profound and palpable shift. The confession had not magically healed the wounds of the past, but it had lanced the infection that had been poisoning Blackwood Manor. A fragile, tentative peace settled over the house, replacing the oppressive, grief-stricken silence. The morning after the storm, Annalise awoke to find that the door to the east wing stood open. Sunlight, weak but persistent, streamed down the corridor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was a simple thing, an open door, but it was a revolution. Alistair was a changed man. The transformation was not sudden or dramatic, but a slow, quiet unfolding. The rigid, icy control was gone, replaced by a deep weariness, but also a new openness. He began to join her for breakfast, the long dining table abandoned in favor of the small, sunny morning room. Their conversations were still stilted at times, awkward with the weight of all that had been unsaid for so long, but they were real. He asked her about her day, about her progress in the garden. He listened, truly listened, when she spoke. He also began to emerge from his study. Annalise would see him walking the grounds, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze thoughtful. He was reacquainting himself with his own home, seeing it not as a prison of memory, but as a place that might, one day, hold a future. The most significant change was in his approach to Lillian. He started going to the nursery himself, not as a remote figure of authority, but as a father. At first, he would simply stand in the doorway, watching as Annalise and Lillian sat together, drawing or reading. His presence was hesitant, as if he were afraid of frightening them away, of bringing his own sadness into their quiet world. Annalise, sensing his uncertainty, began to include him. "Lillian," she would say softly, "your father is here. Shall we show him the picture you drew of the robin?" And Lillian, though still silent, would hold up her drawing for his inspection. Alistair would look at his daughter's creation, at a complex mix of pain and love in his eyes, and he would offer a quiet word of praise. "It's very good, Lillian. You have your mother's eye for color." It was the first time Annalise had heard him refer to Helena as Lillian's mother in a natural, loving way, not as a source of pain. It was a small, crucial step towards healing. Lady Beatrice, finding herself suddenly irrelevant in this new, quiet dynamic, departed in a huff, declaring that the country air had become unutterably dreary. Her absence was a relief, like a tight corset being unlaced. The house could finally breathe. One afternoon, Alistair found Annalise in the rose garden. She was kneeling in the dirt, carefully planting new bulbs she had ordered. The garden was transformed. The weeds were gone, the paths were clear, and the old rose bushes, pruned and tended, were covered in new growth. It was no longer a place of death, but one of promise. He didn't speak for a long time, simply stood and watched her. The setting sun cast a golden light over the garden, catching in her dark hair. She looked up, shielding her eyes with a soil-smudged hand, and gave him a small, warm smile. In that moment, she was not just the dignified Lady Annalise or the capable new Marchioness. She was beautiful, strong, and covered in the dirt of his neglected past, which she was patiently, tirelessly bringing back to life. "It looks as it used to," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It will be even better," she replied, her confidence quiet but sure. "New things are growing alongside the old." It was a statement about more than just the garden. They both knew it. He walked over and knelt beside her on the path, an act that would have been unthinkable for the marble Marquess just a few weeks ago. He reached out and picked up a fallen rose petal, his long fingers turning it over and over. "Annalise," he began, his voice low, I have been a coward and a fool. I have hidden from my life, and in doing so, I have nearly destroyed my daughters, and I have treated you with a coldness you never deserved." "You were grieving," she said softly. "I was drowning," he corrected her. "And I was taking everyone down with me. You came into this house, and you did not let it drown you. You fought back, not with noise and demands, but with this." He gestured to the garden, to the life springing up around them. "With quiet, patient strength, you have shown me more compassion than I have any right to expect." He looked at her, his grey eyes, once so cold, now filled with a warmth that made her heart ache. "The terms of our agreement, they were monstrous, unfair. I would like to renegotiate." Annalise's breath caught in her throat. "Renegotiate." "I no longer want a Marchioness of convenience," he said, his gaze intense, unwavering. "I no longer want a contractual mother for my child. I want a wife, a partner, a friend, if you would have me." The vulnerability in his voice, in his eyes, was a raw and powerful thing. This was the real man, the man who had been buried beneath 5 years of guilt and sorrow. And he was offering her his broken, healing heart. Tears welled in Annalise's eyes. She had come to Blackwood seeking security, a loveless, practical arrangement. She had steeled herself for a life of quiet endurance. She had never, in her wildest dreams, allowed herself to hope for this. She had not even realized, until this very moment, how much she had come to care for this sad, complicated man. She had fallen in love with him not in spite of his brokenness, but because of the strength and goodness she saw shining through the cracks. "Alistair," she whispered, her voice trembling. He reached out, his hand covering hers on the cool earth. His touch was no longer hesitant, but firm and sure. He leaned in, his face just inches from hers. The scent of rain and roses and damp earth filled her senses. Annalise, he murmured again, his name for her a soft prayer. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound tenderness. It was a kiss of gratitude, of apology, of hope. It was the sealing of a new bargain, one written on the heart, not on paper. It tasted of salt from her tears and the promise of a future she had never dared to imagine. When they finally broke apart, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the garden was bathed in the soft, purple light of twilight. They knelt there for a long moment, hand in hand, in the quiet sanctuary they had, together, brought back from the dead. The final wall crumbled a week later. Annalise and Alistair were walking with Lillian by the lake. It was a bright, clear morning, the air fresh and clean after a night of rain. Alistair was skipping stones across the water's surface, a skill he was trying, with patient humour, to teach his daughter. Lillian, for her part, was watching with rapt attention, a small, genuine smile on her face. She was a different child. The shadows had receded from her eyes, replaced by the light of a rediscovered childhood. Annalise sat on a nearby bench, watching them, her heart so full it felt close to bursting. This was family. This was home. Alistair found a particularly flat, smooth stone. "Now watch this one, Lilypad," he said, using a nickname Annalise had never heard before. "This one will fly." He flicked his wrist, and the stone skipped across the water, once, twice, 3, 4, 5 times before sinking. Lillian's eyes were wide with wonder. She looked at the ripples spreading across the lake, then up at her father. She opened her mouth, and a small, clear sound emerged, a sound no one had heard from her in 5 years. "Again," she said. The word was quiet, a little rusty from disuse, but it was perfectly, miraculously clear. Alistair froze, the stone he was about to throw dropping from his hand. He turned to his daughter, his face a mask of disbelief and overwhelming joy. Annalise rose from the bench, her own hands flying to her mouth, tears instantly springing to her eyes. Lillian looked from her father's stunned face to Annalise's tearful one, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Alistair immediately knelt in front of her, his expression softening into one of pure, unadulterated love. "Yes, my darling," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, again, as many times as you want." He hugged her then, a fierce, protective embrace, burying his face in her dark hair. Lillian, after a moment's surprise, hugged him back, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Over his daughter's shoulder, Alistair's eyes met Annalise's. They were shining with tears, but also with a love so profound it needed no words. Later that evening, after a very talkative Lillian was tucked into bed, a Lillian who wanted to know the names of every bird, every flower, every star, Alistair found Annalise on the terrace overlooking the blooming rose garden. The night was clear, the sky a canopy of glittering stars. He came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into his embrace, her head resting on his shoulder. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the night. "I love you, Annalise," he said softly, his voice a warm rumble against her ear. "I don't think I understood what that word even meant until you came here. You walked into the darkest, most broken places of my life, and you were not afraid. You brought the light back in. You saved us." Annalise turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to cup his jaw. She looked into his eyes, the clear, steady grey eyes of the man she loved. "We saved each other," she whispered. He smiled, a true, genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. That we did. He kissed her then, a deep, searching kiss full of love and promise, a declaration under the stars. The lonely, broken Marquess of Blackwood was gone forever. In his place was Alistair, a husband and a father, a man who had walked through the fire of his past and emerged, with her help, whole again. Annalise knew their life would not be without its scars. The past would always be a part of their story. But it was no longer a ghost that haunted them. It was simply a part of the path that had, against all odds, led them to this moment, to this love. She had come to Blackwood Manor as part of a desperate bargain, an uninvited stranger at the feast of a great house. But she was leaving the past behind, and in its place she had found everything she had never known she wanted. She had found a home. She had found a family. And in the heart of the marble Marquess, she had found a love that was more real and more precious than any society dowry or fairy tale romance. It was a love that had been earned in the dirt of a neglected garden and the silence of a grieving heart. 1 year later, the great hall of Blackwood Manor, once so cold and silent, was filled with the sound of laughter. Sunlight streamed through the tall, clean windows, illuminating a scene of domestic chaos and joy. A large rocking horse, a new addition, stood near the fireplace, where a cheerful fire now blazed. On the floor, a 6-year-old Lillian, her pigtails flying, was chasing a small, yapping terrier, her voice a stream of happy, non-stop chatter. Annalise sat in a comfortable armchair, her lap occupied by a pile of mending, though little mending was getting done. Her attention was on her family. She was several months pregnant, her condition a soft, happy rounding beneath her simple day dress. Her life was overflowing with a contentment so deep and steady it felt like the bedrock of her very soul. Alistair entered the hall, his boots echoing a cheerful rhythm on the stone floor. He was no longer the man in black. He wore riding breeches and a linen shirt, his face tanned from the sun, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. He scooped up a giggling Lillian, tossing her into the air before settling her on his hip. He walked over to Annalise, his free hand coming to rest on her shoulder, his thumb stroking the curve of her neck. He leaned down and kissed her, a familiar, loving gesture that still made her heart flutter. "Mr. Abernathy says the Blackwood bloom is having its best year yet," he said, his eyes sparkling. "He says it's your touch." "It's all of ours," Annalise replied, her hand covering his where it rested on her shoulder. "We all brought the garden back to life." Lillian squirmed in his arms, pointing a small finger towards Annalise's stomach. "When is the baby coming out?" she demanded, a question she asked at least twice a day. Alistair chuckled. "Soon, Lily Pad, soon. And then you'll have to teach him how to skip stones." "Or her," Annalise corrected gently. "Or her," he agreed, his smile widening. He looked from his chattering daughter to his glowing wife, his heart full. The ghosts of Blackwood Manor had been laid to rest, replaced by the vibrant, noisy, beautiful life of the family he had almost lost the chance to have. He had thought his life was over that day in the garden 5 years ago, but he had been wrong. It had simply been waiting for a brave, compassionate woman to walk in uninvited and show him how to begin again. Looking at Annalise, at the quiet strength and endless love in her eyes, he knew he was the luckiest man in the world. The bargain he had made in a London ballroom had been the best deal of his life, not a purchase of a convenient wife, but the discovery of his own salvation. Dear listener, isn't it a powerful thought that sometimes the most profound changes in our lives don't begin with a grand entrance, but with a quiet, courageous step into a place we're not sure we belong? Annalise walked into Alistair's life, a world frozen by grief and locked away from the light. She didn't have a magic key or a loud declaration. She had something far more potent: quiet persistence and compassion. How many of us have encountered our own locked doors or neglected gardens? They might not be literal wings of a manor house, but they exist in our hearts, in our relationships, in the parts of our lives we've deemed too painful to touch. We let the weeds of past hurts grow. We allow the dust of regret to settle, until we forget that life and beauty are still possible there. Annalise's story is a beautiful reminder that healing doesn't always come from tearing down the old walls, but from gently, patiently tending to what's there. She started with one small patch of earth, one silent child, one quiet act of care at a time. She showed up, day after day, not knowing if her efforts would ever bear fruit. And in doing so, she didn't just revive a garden or a family. She created a space where love could finally grow again. Perhaps there's a neglected corner of your own world that could use a little tending, a relationship that needs a gentle word, a dream that needs to be cleared of the weeds of self-doubt, a part of your own heart that needs to be reminded of the sunlight. It might feel like back-breaking, thankless work at first, but as Annalise discovered, the simple, consistent act of showing up with an open heart has the power to bring even the most desolate places back into bloom. You don't have to fix everything at once. Just start. Clear one weed, plant one seed, let the light in. You might be astonished at what begins to grow. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that even after the longest winter, spring is always possible. Until next time.